Thank you so much. Am I on? It's a little dangerous to say I'm an answer to a prayer before I have given the talk, but I'll just assume you all know what you're doing. Just out of curiosity, how many of you, this is your second or third time at one of these conferences? Look at that. How many of you, keep your hands up if it's more, you've been here more than 5 times. Wow. Talking to Christian, my partner from the seminary here, he said he used to bring his little girls here to this seminary, and the oldest one is now 17. So it's really exciting that this has been going on so long and that so many of you have been coming along. Thanks to Frank for getting you all awake, keeping you. My job is now to keep you awake. All right, before we all take our afternoon siestas, I'm going to do the best job of that I can. My subject this afternoon for you is going to be the text of the New Testament. All right, now why are we talking about the text of the New Testament? There's a couple reasons. One is because when you read your Bible at some point, if you're a careful Bible reader, you're going to find that you have footnotes in your Bible that may say something like this. Take a passage like Luke 23, verse 34, a very famous text where Jesus is on the cross. You remember this? And he prays for those who are crucifying him and says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then the text tells us they cast lots to divide his garments. Now, if you're reading your Bible carefully and you have a modern translation, you probably have a footnote there saying something like, some manuscripts omit the sentence, "and Jesus, ... they do." Now, if you're looking closely, what's in between those dots is the whole prayer. Yeah? So some manuscripts don't have this prayer. So some of you may encounter the question we're going to talk about in this talk from your own Bible, in your own footnotes. Others of you are going to counter it when you're talking to people and they're going to be skeptical of the Bible, and they're going to say, how could you believe a book that's so old, especially when it's just been copied and copied and copied, and we don't really know what it says? They may not even have to have read someone like Bart Ehrman, but they have probably heard his view, if not from him, from someone else. So here's what he says in his well-known book from 2005. He says, how does it help us to say the Bible is the inerrant word of God if in fact we do not have the words that God inerrantly inspired? I first read these words the same time many young people come across this idea, and that was in college. What made it a little bit different for me was I happened to be at the same college that Bart Ehrman had gone to, Moody Bible Institute, where we used to joke that Bible was our middle name. Bart Ehrman used to be an evangelical, studied the topic we're going to talk about now, and as a result of that changed his faith and then later lost it. He's now a famous agnostic. Now the thing about Bart Ehrman is that Bart Ehrman is a well-trained New Testament scholar. When he talks about the manuscripts of the New Testament, he does know what he's talking about from experience and from his own scholarship. But it does not always stay there. Sometimes the views that start in the academy, in the university, they come down to the popular level through cartoons. In this case, someone like Scott Adams. Scott Adams read Bart Ehrman's book, and I just want to give you his impression from the book that he read, because this is, in many ways, the kind of attitude that people have towards the Bible. He says, I never knew that there are about a zillion different versions of the Bible because it was copied and recopied by hand by semi-literate, opinionated morons for hundreds of years. Yeah? Now, I think it's fair to say, at least from my experience talking to people, that this is often the kind of default opinion that many unbelievers have about the Bible today. Not all of them, thankfully, but more and more, and especially young people if they've gone to university, they've gone to college, right? Perhaps they've taken a Religion 101 class. And in that Religion 101 class, that professor's goal has been to give the student a view of the Bible that it's old, that it's outdated, that you couldn't possibly trust it with your life, right? Maybe you've heard it in the form of the telephone game, that the Bible was copied sort of like we play the telephone game. Do you know? We'll come back to that and see why that's not the case. But that's the question I want to address with you this afternoon, is this question of how did we get the New Testament text? Now, again, you might say, this seems so esoteric. Why would we talk about the reliability of the New Testament text? Can't we talk about the reliability of the New Testament or the reliability of the resurrection? But you know what the problem is? If we start there, it doesn't matter what the New Testament says about the resurrection if what the New Testament says we don't actually know. Are you with me? You have to know what the New Testament says before you can know whether or not what it says is actually true. So later talks in this conference are going to talk to you about the reliability of the resurrection, but I'm going to talk to you about something that in some ways, at some level, is actually more foundational, because if we don't know what the New Testament claims, then we can't even talk about whether those claims are true or false. Are you with me on this? All right. So that's why we're talking about this subject, okay? But before I do, let me talk to you about why we even need to talk about this, why there's an issue, okay? Talk to you about why it's important, but why do we need to do this thing that's called textual criticism? Now, let me say a word about that term, all right? In textual criticism, we scholars are comparing the copies of the New Testament that we have to each other to try to determine what it originally said. All right, that's basically what the job is. So don't get thrown by that word criticism. It really just means study. Okay, we're not criticizing the text. We're studying it to try to get back to the original. Why? First of all, because the originals are all lost. Right? We don't have the parchment that Paul wrote the letter to Romans on when he sent it to the church at Rome. That's actually not surprising at all because we have pretty much no originals of any ancient writing from the ancient world. Okay? One of the few places where papyrus can survive is in a dry climate like ours, a dry, hot climate especially. And so most of these early manuscripts of the New Testament come from Egypt. But Paul didn't write from Egypt, and he didn't write to Egypt, did he? So at some point, his original copy to the Roman church probably disintegrated or was lost. Second, the reason why we need to do this thing called textual criticism and study it and talk about it is because copying by hand is hard. Now, some of you don't know this because you don't copy much by hand anymore, right? You send texts, you send emails. But if you don't believe me, here's your task, okay? After this talk, after the Q&A, after the break, and you got a little break for dinner, you sit down and you try to copy Romans. Yeah, okay? And then you bring that back. Then I want you to show your friend, and your friend is going to compare it to the book of Romans in their New Testament, and they're going to see how many mistakes you made, right? Copying by hand is hard. One little note that we often find in manuscripts from New Testament scribes comes at the end when they were done, and they said, as a traveler rejoices to see his home country, so a scribe rejoices to see the end of a book. Why? Because it's hard. Okay, copying by hand is hard, and they did make mistakes. They made mistakes because it was hard, and that means our surviving copies of the New Testament do not all agree, as we will see. Now, there's a fourth reason that's really important. Okay, these first three reasons are all historical. They are true of every piece of ancient literature, from Homer to Tacitus to Josephus to anything pretty much written before the printing press, and honestly, even in some cases, things that were written after the printing press. Okay? Even after the printing press, we still have complications of knowing what the author said or wrote. Let me give you a quick example. Imagine a poet who's living well after the invention of the printing press. He writes down his poem. He sends them to his editor, and the editor makes some changes, sends them back to him. He makes some further changes, and then it gets printed and published in the first edition, but the printer has made some changes that neither the editor nor the author approved of. And then later, the publisher wants to put out a second edition. They go back to the author and say, do you want to make any changes? And he does. Are you with me? And now 100 years later, some scholar in an English department somewhere is deciding to make a critical edition, an academic edition of this poet's poetry. What text are they going to print to the poem? Are you with me? Actually, when it comes to the Bible, this problem is in some ways much easier than it is for modern authors because of the issue of editors being involved in all that. Okay, so just so you know, this has to be done on lots of all ancient literature and even some modern literature. It all needs textual criticism, all right? But here's the fourth reason I want you to keep in mind, and that is, I don't know any Christian of any stripe who thinks that God inspired scribes like he did the authors. Are you with me? We as Christians believe that God inspired the biblical writers because that's what Scripture teaches. Paul says in 1 Timothy, he says all Scripture is inspired by God, right? But there's no verse that says all subsequent scribes who copied Scripture are inspired by God. Are you with me? We believe that God protected the authors of Scripture from error in a way he did not promise to protect the scribes who copied it. All right, so that's a theological reason. Those first three reasons are historical, but I think the fourth one is really important as Christians for us to keep in mind, okay? All right, so let's look at the evidence that we have for doing this. How do we get back to the original text? Why do we think that our Bibles are based on a good text? The first type of evidence we have is Greek manuscripts. Now, this is good because the New Testament was written in Greek, all right? And now, one of the things I want to do, since this is an apologetics conference, is I want to disabuse you of some myths that are out there on our side of things, yeah? Sometimes we as Christians, we're so eager to make a confident case for the Scriptures or for our faith that we end up peddling misinformation, all right? And one of the things that I have done in my scholarship is try to correct the record on our side as Christians so that we can present a better case for this, okay? But when it comes to Greek manuscripts, we have about 5,000 plus manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, okay? Sometimes people say the number like 5,800 or closer to 6,000, and those numbers, in my view, are far too inflated, okay? The number is closer to about 5,000, all right? Secondly, we have translations. You read the Bible in translation, so did many early Christians. Because early on, the New Testament was translated into languages like Latin. It was translated into Syriac. It was translated into Coptic, which is an Egyptian language that uses Greek letters. It was eventually translated into languages like Old Church Slavonic. Any Old Church Slavonic speakers here this morning? Oh, I got one! That's the first hand I've ever seen on that question. We need to talk, sir. Okay, but early on, Christians translated the Bible into other languages, and so we have copies of the New Testament in these other languages, and they can help us try to get back to the original text. We'll talk about some of the limitations they present in just a second, but the third type of evidence is citations from what we call the church fathers. Early Christian theologians and preachers obviously used the Bible in their writings, and they quoted from it, right? They used it in their writing, all right? So that can help us get back to the original text. One of the blessings of church father citations is that we often know where they lived and when they lived. Yeah? Whereas we often don't know exactly when a Greek manuscript was copied, and we often know very little about where it was copied. Okay? Now, two limitations I need to mention about translations and citations. Okay? The first one is, as we probably know, sometimes things get lost in translation, right? No two languages are the same. As an example, the Latin language does not have a definite article like the word the, yeah? But Greek does. Well, that's going to be a problem then if you want to use the Latin translation to try to know if the Greek article is there or not, because Latin's not going to help you do that, okay? So sometimes there are limitations of translations and using them to get back to the Greek text. When it comes to citations, we also have problems in that the church fathers sometimes quoted from memory rather than from manuscript. Okay, now for the preachers in the room, I'm going to pick on you just for a second, okay? Now I know this conference is meant to encourage you, but just for a second, I'm going to pick on you, okay? Have you ever been preaching and you did something like, well, you know that one verse that says that one thing about, right? And you give half the verse correctly? You're not so sure about the second part of that verse, yeah? Sometimes the church fathers did that too, okay? So I mean, sometimes their citations are different from what we have in our Greek manuscripts precisely because they're quoting them from memory rather than manuscript, okay? So things like that. So it makes translations and citations have their value, but they're more limited in the Greek manuscripts. Thankfully, as I said, we have lots of Greek manuscripts, okay? We'll compare it to ancient literature in just a second, but I do want to add some qualifications, all right? Not all of these manuscripts are equally early. Okay? So sometimes we as Christians make a mistake. We say something like we have 5,000 Greek manuscripts, and then we might say, and they're really, really early, and if we're not careful, we give people the impression that they're all equally early. Are you with me? But they're not, and so this chart just gives you a measure of where they occur in the centuries, okay? So you can see we have a boom in the 12th century and 11th century when Christianity is dominant in the eastern part of the European world. All right? If I give you some context here, that little gentleman there on the bottom right, that's Gutenberg, okay? You can see people are still copying by hand after Gutenberg. Isn't that fascinating? I always wonder, but then I think, well, it's probably because, I mean, if you had the choice between having a Bible that was printed and one that somebody copied by hand, it seems like a hand-copied one would be even cooler. So maybe that's why they kept doing it. That little explosion there is the Muslim invasion of the eastern part of the empire, again in Constantinople there. That may be, I'm not sure on this, but that may be why there's a little dip here, okay, in the 7th and 8th century, okay? But the main point I want you to get from this chart is to show you that not all manuscripts are equally early, okay? Now that's actually not a terrible thing. Do you know why? Because earlier is not always better. All the youngest children in the room said, amen, right? I'm the youngest of 5. I think by the 5th one, my parents got it right. Anyways, early is not always better. Let me give you a concrete example. This is a manuscript on the left called P72. The P stands for papyrus. That's the material it's written on. And it's a copy of 1st and 2nd Peter. It's from the 3rd and 4th century. It's one of our earliest copies of these letters from the New Testament. Unfortunately, it's not a great copy. It's not a great copy. The scribe took too much liberty in his willingness to change things. So we have a number of readings in this manuscript that are only found in this manuscript because apparently the scribe felt too much freedom to make the text say what he thought it meant. But this one on the right, which unfortunately I couldn't find a color picture of, is known as manuscript 323. They don't have the most creative names for these things, okay? But it's from the 12th century. It's late and really, really good. If I had a choice between which of these manuscripts I wanted my English Bible to be based on, I would pick the one on the right any day, even though it's some 800 years later. Now, this should be really encouraging to us as Christians, because it means over a span of 12 centuries, scribes were still copying the text carefully and faithfully. Are you with me on that? So don't make the mistake of thinking that earlier is always necessarily better. All right? In fact, in the ranking of these two manuscripts in the latest edition of the Greek New Testament, the one on the left ranks around 115th out of 100 plus manuscripts. The one on the right ranks 5th overall. Isn't that amazing? Okay? They're still not radically different from each other, but still, in terms of the absolute ranking of these, the one on the left is better. All right. So older is not always better. Younger can be good. The other thing to know about the number of manuscripts is they don't all contain a full New Testament. In fact, it's relatively rare to find a manuscript of the New Testament that has all 27 books, Matthew to Revelation. So what you see on this chart is that little tiny orange sliver at the bottom of my charts that says 59 on it. That is about the number of manuscripts that we have out of those 5,000 that have a complete New Testament, Matthew to Revelation. Are you with me? And then the rest of the bars are how many manuscripts have the rest of the section. So you can see Revelation has about over 270 copies. Look at the Gospels. Yeah? Over 2,000 copies of the Gospels in Greek. Do you know why? Because Christians loved the Gospels. Do you know why? You know why? Because they loved Jesus. Okay? I don't want to step on any toes here this morning, okay? This afternoon, but perhaps we might put a little more emphasis on Jesus than we do on the details of our eschatology. Yeah, I'm not saying eschatology is not important. I saw the eschatology section in the bookstore before I spoke. I made sure to check it. Yeah, but let's keep the main thing. That's what they did. Now, but why did they do this? Why do they have so few of the whole New Testament? Do you know what the simple reason is? Because manuscripts were expensive. And this is something that's really important for us to know as Christians. Most people in church history have not had what you have. They have not had a complete New Testament that they could carry around in their hand, take to church, do their devotions from, read from anytime they want. They certainly didn't have it in this format, did they? They didn't have a choice between multiple translations either. Say, well, this one's not very clear. Let me just pick a different one. Because Bibles were expensive, yeah? So when they had to pick, and they often did, they chose to have a copy of the Gospels, yeah? This really came home to me a number of years ago when I was digitizing Greek New Testament manuscripts in Florence, Italy, at the Medici Library there. It's a beautiful library. Part of it was designed by Michelangelo. And I get to spend about 5 weeks there. And at one point, the curator of the library took us into the reading room. And this reading room was one of the earliest public libraries in the world. Goes back to the era of the Medicis, okay, so think Middle Ages. And she showed us how in the back half of the room were the shelves where they held the books. And then the front half of the room were stand-up reading desks. They were stand-up desks. They were way ahead of their time, okay, on that one. But underneath those stand-up desks, I noticed, so you put the book up here, and then underneath there was a metal bar that ran the whole length. And I couldn't figure out what that was until later in the week when we were digitizing a manuscript, and they brought it to us, and that manuscript had a metal chain connected to the spine. And then it clicked for me. They would bring the book out to you at that reading desk, and they would literally chain the book to the desk so you couldn't steal it. Which I would say is a different approach to late fees, isn't it? But the reason they did that was because books were expensive. Shouldn't we be grateful to have Bibles that we can carry in our hands? Shouldn't we also know them better than they did back then because we have such easy access to them? We should. All right. I'm going to try not to preach today, okay? But keep that in mind. Okay. So not all our 5,000 copies are equally early, and that's okay because early is not always better. They're not all complete copies of the New Testament, okay? Some of them are just part of the New Testament because that's how they copied things. They're also not equally big. So the one on the left here is our earliest fragment of Mark's gospel from the 2nd or 3rd century. In fact, just published and identified in the last 5 years. And it's like the size of a credit card. Compared to the one on the right, Codex Sinaiticus, that little orange square, that's your P137, your earliest copy of Mark. It's just a tiny little piece, right? Our earliest complete copy of Mark is in the manuscript on the right there, Codex Sinaiticus. It's very, very important, all right? Now, one of the exciting things about the field that I study, all right, is that we keep discovering more. So back in 2019, actually, as a result of this little manuscript here on the left, which was, you may have heard about it in the news, it was pegged as being a first century copy of Mark, okay? And some Christian apologists got a hold of this and got a little bit too excited. It turned out when it was published that it was actually probably 2nd or 3rd century, still very early and important. But the organization that owned it, okay, the guy who was in charge of it was actually trying to sell it to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. He was not supposed to do that. Okay, I'd love to tell you that story, but I always like to say my field is nothing if not exciting. It is certainly not boring. Anyways, this guy tried to sell this manuscript for millions of dollars. As a result, the Egypt Exploration Society that owned it went through all their archives and thought, we better get a better handle on what we have. Probably a good idea. Okay, probably a good idea. When they did this, here's what they announced back in March of 2019. They said, we found some 20 New Testament unedited manuscripts that we've identified and over 80 Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and related texts that are currently known to them and will be gradually assigned to be published. Why does it take time? Because these things take a long time to study and publish. I went to see them actually once in Oxford, and I got to see they have these just in shoe boxes. They dug all these manuscripts up from the desert sands in Egypt, literally in a trash dump. People had thrown them away. Two guys named Grenfell and Hunt went and discovered them back in the early 20th century, and they brought them to Oxford. And many of them are still in these boxes, and if you look them out, they're covered in mud. And one of the reasons why it takes so long to get these published is because you've got to carefully pick that mud, that dry dirt off of the manuscript without taking the what off? The ink, right? So they take a long time and take very, very careful skills to edit these. But isn't that exciting? We got more New Testament manuscripts coming in the next decade or so than we've had. Now this is really important because sometimes people will think that the further away we get from the time of the New Testament, the less we know about what its text actually said. So I've had some people say, even when you think in terms of translation, that maybe the King James is better because it's closer to the time of the New Testament. Friends, the truth is actually the exact opposite. Because we keep discovering new copies that we didn't have before, and that enhances our knowledge of that original text. So the Bibles you have in your hands today are probably, I think it's fair to say, based on better manuscript evidence than anybody in history has ever had access to, ever. Isn't that amazing? Again, perhaps a reason for us to read it. All right. Let's compare some of our New Testament to other ancient documents to put this in perspective, okay? Let's take Mark's gospel because it's probably the earliest gospel written. It also is one of our least attested manuscripts early on. I showed you that slide before. Our earliest copy is from the 2nd or 3rd century, and it's just a little piece. And then we don't get a complete copy of Mark, okay, with no fragmentary elements to it until the 4th century. But Mark's gospel is probably written in about 50 to 60 AD. Our earliest copy is the one I just showed you. All told, though, we have well over 1,700 copies of Mark's gospel. That's pretty good, isn't it? It's really good. If you compare it to the Jewish historian Josephus, who writes about the same time as Mark, his earliest copy is from the 4th century, and then the manuscripts we have of him are about 130 or more. Are you with me? Now, maybe even a better comparison in my mind is from the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe raise your hand if you've heard of the Gospel of Thomas. Okay. This is one of these so-called non-canonical Gospels that people maybe love to ask you about and say, well, what about those? You know, maybe that's the real Jesus. Well, the funny thing about the Gospel of Thomas is it's not even a narrative of Jesus' life. And you know what it's missing? The resurrection and the death of Jesus. How important would you say those two things are to the story of Jesus? Pretty important, wouldn't you? Yeah. In fact, even calling it a gospel is something we do just because that's what the manuscript says, not because it matches what the actual gospel is. But it's probably written sometime in the 2nd century, and our earliest copy is the 3rd century. And all told, you know how many total copies we have of the Gospel of Thomas? 4. 3 of those are fragmentary, and only those 3 are in the original language it was written in, which is Greek. The only complete copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas is in Coptic, and it's translated from the Greek. Now, here's the point. If somebody says to you that we should be skeptical about the New Testament because of the manuscript evidence, they should be much more skeptical about something like the Gospel of Thomas. And yet, so often in our culture, it's the opposite, isn't it? where people find something esoteric like the Gospel of Thomas and think, well, that's the real Jesus. Yeah. But actually, they should be trusting the New Testament Gospels far, far more. They're far better attested. Sometimes it takes someone who's not a New Testament scholar to recognize this. You've probably never heard of this gentleman, okay? Don't feel bad if you haven't. His name is Giorgio Pasquali. He's an Italian classicist, so he studies classics, okay? He's passed on. He's from the 20th century. But nobody makes better classical scholars than the Italians, and Giorgio Pasquali is one of the best. And here's what he said in his famous book on the subject of classics. He says, no other Greek text is handed down so richly and credibly as the New Testament. Are you with me? That's not a Christian scholar saying that. That's a classical scholar saying that. All right? So one of the reasons why we have such confidence in the text of our New Testament is because we have such good evidence for it, both in quantity and quality. But let's think for a second a little bit more about this quality question. Because we need to ask, okay, it's one thing to say we have 5,000 copies, okay? And even in a book like Revelation, where we don't have that many, we have several hundred. The question is, yeah, but how well were they copied, right? Because if I have 200 copies that are bad copies, how many bad copies do I have? 200, yeah? What we want are good copies. And so back to someone like Bart Ehrman, who says the problem with trusting the New Testament text because of how many manuscripts we have is this issue of quality. And that the earlier we go in the history of copying these texts, the less skilled and attentive the scribes appear to have been. Are you with me? Now, I just gave you an example of that, didn't I? I said P72 is one of our earliest copies of 1st and 2nd Peter, and it's not nearly as well copied as that 12th century manuscript I showed you. Are you with me? So I actually think he's right in general terms, but there's a problem. All right? Now, okay, this is going to be a problem. I have to drive back to Phoenix tonight, so we're not going to use that example. Okay? But I want you to think for a second about how comparisons work. Okay? Think about it. Now, we're going to split the room here. Okay? Every so often I like to just split my audience in half. Okay? Get you to disagree with each other. Who's the better basketball player? LeBron. If you think Michael Jordan is the better basketball player, raise your hand. Good. Good. If you think LeBron James is the better basketball player, the doors are right there, there, and there. See yourself out. Okay, all right. I grew up watching Michael Jordan play. We know he's the better basketball player. However, okay, LeBron fans, you can stay. However, no one would say that because Michael Jordan is objectively the better basketball player, that therefore LeBron James is a bad basketball player. Are you with me? So keep this in mind, because sometimes I find that people can hear a scholar say something like Bart Ehrman said in that last slide, and they think, well, I'm not a scholar. I don't know how to answer this. And sometimes, you know what? God has given you everything you need to do to answer a skeptic by just thinking through a little bit more carefully what they said. Don't immediately get put off or insecure because they've said something about evidence you're not familiar with or an area of subject. Just think through it logically. And this is a great case. Just because earlier scribes are not as good as later ones does not mean that they are bad. Are you with me? Overall, they are still very, very good. All right? Now, that doesn't mean we have no mistakes. We do. So let me show you some examples, okay? Here's a great example I like to give. This is from Mark 1:1, the very first verse of what's probably the first gospel written. All right? And this is from Codex Sinaiticus, that manuscript I showed you just a minute ago, that huge one, from the 4th century. And in Mark 1:1, your New Testament, your English Bible says, almost certainly, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Are you with me? And that's a really important theme in Mark's Gospels, we'll see. But the problem is some of our manuscripts, and you can see it here in Mark 1:1 of Codex Sinaiticus, inside that little circle. Do you see those tiny little words written up there between the margin? You want to guess? You don't have to know Greek. You want to bet what those words are? Son of God. Yeah? We have a number of manuscripts that do not have the words Son of God there. And so some scholars have made a big deal about this. And they'll say, well, see, here's a case where scribes have changed the New Testament text and they've elevated Jesus from just being the Messiah, Christ, to being the Son of God. And that's a later addition from scribes. Are you with me? There's two problems with that. Okay? The first one is one that you can figure out just from reading Mark's Gospel. Because this is hardly the only place that Mark calls Jesus the Son of God, is it? In fact, you don't even have to get out of chapter 1 of Mark before he's baptized and the voice from heaven says, this is my beloved. Is he the Son of God? Of course he is. And then fascinatingly, the next people that recognize him as the Son of God are not his disciples like we might expect. It's the evil, unclean spirits, isn't it? Well, how would they know that he's the Son of God? Maybe because they know exactly who he is and what he's come to do. And then climactically in Mark's gospel, at the trial scene, Jesus finally admits that he's the Son of God. And then at the crucifixion is the high point of Mark's gospel. There's a centurion soldier, a Roman, not a Jew, who stands there, sees the way he dies, and says, surely this man was the Son of God. So does Mark's gospel teach us that Jesus is the Son of God? Of course. The issue in this verse is whether he calls him that at the very first verse and wants us as readers to know it from the beginning, or does he want us to sort of read it like a whodunit novel and figure it out as we go? Are you with me? That's the real question. It's not whether Jesus is the Son of God. Oops, sorry about that. All right, it's whether or not Mark says it in the first verse. I happen to think Mark does, and I want to show you why from another manuscript, okay? This is a manuscript in another part of Italy that I had the privilege of getting to spend time with, an afternoon with one time when I was there. This happens to be from a complete copy of the New Testament, so it's one of those rare 60 copies I told you about, yeah? And now I do need to confess, my Italian is not very good, and the librarians either said you may take pictures of this manuscript or they said you may not. Okay? So I'm just going to need you to keep that between us, okay? For folks watching online, please do not tweet about this part. Okay. Anyways, I went through this manuscript, spent an afternoon with it, and I looked at page after page, and one of the things I found interesting was this scribe on almost every page did something like you see out here in the margin. Do you see that? Now, what's funny is if you read the text, it says in Greek, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then it has this symbol that is not a Greek letter. And sure enough, that symbol is repeated out here. And again, you don't have to know Greek. You want to guess what that says out there in the margin? Son of God. Yeah? Now again, you don't have to know Greek to figure out why he made the mistake. Do you see what that letter is? It looks like our letter U. It's the Greek letter upsilon at the end of the word Christ. And guess what that letter is right there? U, upsilon. Have you done this where you've been writing something out and you've skipped over some words because you're writing the same letter or the same part of the word? Scribes did this too. The scribe, you have to remember, he's copying from one manuscript to another manuscript, which means his eyes are constantly going back and forth, right? So he copies the letter U here for Christ, then goes back to his manuscript and says, I'll pick up at the letter U because that's what I just wrote. But he accidentally picks up with this one and keeps writing and accidentally leaves it out. Are you with me on how that works? Do you know how I know this scribe made that mistake? Because I went through the whole manuscript, and on page after page, he had corrections like this out in the margin, and about half of them, by my count, were the result of this exact same kind of mistake of his eye skipping from one letter to another, or from one word that's the same to another word that's the same. Are you with me? I can prove it. Here's the same page. So we're still in Mark 1:1. He's made the exact same mistake. You can see the letter U there again, yeah, with the line over it. Zoom in. And the end of this part is the letter U. He's done the same thing. He's left something out because his eye jumped from the letter U to the letter U. He figured it out. I always like to say, this particular medieval scribe was not the best scribe. But he was a decent corrector, wasn't he? Now this is important because this gives lie to the idea that the New Testament was copied like we play the telephone game. Yeah? Remember playing the telephone game as a kid? You make a line of kids, and the first kids think up some phrase to say he tells the next kid, and by the end of the line, it's not even remotely similar. And people will often say, that's the way the Bible was copied, and that's why you can't trust it. What's the response to that? It's right here in a picture. Because you know what you can't do in the telephone game? You're not allowed to say, hey, let me stop, and jump the line, and go back and hear what somebody 2 or 3 people ahead of me said. You know what else you can't do in the telephone game that scribes did? You can't have multiple lines of transmission. But that's exactly what the copying of the New Testament is. You have multiple lines of transmission. Yeah? Imagine if in the telephone game you start with the message here, and the second person gets to tell not one person, but 3 people. And each of those people starts their own line so that we as scholars can come along later and interview half of them and figure out where they were in the line, and then we can piece back together much more likely what the original message is. Are you with me? So again, this scribe's not a great scribe, but he is a good corrector. In fact, sometimes he realized he couldn't even finish the correction because you can see what he did up here. He started to make the correction up here and then realized, oh shoot, I left out a bit more than I thought, and it's not going to fit in the margin. So he has to scrape out the correction there and then write it in the margin. He's also made a mistake here that he's marked with little dots, and he's made a mistake there that he's crossed out. Yeah? Scribes could correct their work. One more quick example of the same kind of mistake. In the King James Version, we heard from Frank earlier about us being the children of God from 1 John. In the King James Version, we don't have this extra bit here in 1 John 3:1 that says, see what great love the Father has lavished on us that we should be called children of God. And then John says, and we are. Isn't that a precious promise? We are. Charles Spurgeon, the famous Baptist preacher, preached a whole sermon on this variant, on this difference, because he loved those two words so much, and we are. He said, when the devil tempts you with sin, you remind him that you're a child of God. From this passage. Simple mistake to make, though. Do you know how I know? Because there it is in a manuscript there. On the top, from a late manuscript, from a medieval manuscript, I know you can't read that, but that says, and we are right there. And it's the same three letters at the end of and we are that come right before it. So same kind of mistake we just saw in Mark 1:1, right? Scribes make these kind of mistakes. Now that raises a question, how many of these kinds of mistakes are there? Thankfully, most of the mistakes in our manuscripts are really easy to spot. Okay? It's like when I send an email, now maybe you've never done this, but you've sent an email and you thought you typed the word the, but you spelled it T-E-H, yeah? Or in a text. Anybody getting that email knows exactly what I meant to write, don't they? Yeah. They know what I meant to write because T-E-H is not an English word, but T-H-E is an English word, and they know what I meant. Most of our differences in the manuscripts are of that type. They are obvious mistakes that are very easy to know, not only what the scribe meant to say, but also then what the original said, too. But let's look at some hard data. In John chapter 18, it's one of the few places where scholars have been able to compare all the manuscripts we have. Do you know that one of the problems that we face in my discipline is too much evidence? That's one of our biggest problems, too much evidence. We have so many manuscripts, we cannot study them all in the same level of detail. Okay? Now, frankly, we don't need to study all in the same level of detail because at a certain point they get pretty repetitious. Okay? But still, there are manuscripts that have never been looked at in great detail because we simply have so many. But in John 18, scholars have been able to go through 1,659 Greek manuscripts. We're not even talking about the versions. We're not even talking about the church father citations here. Just Greek manuscripts. And I, one summer when I was bored in my PhD, thought I'm going to go through and count all the differences that the scholars recorded. That's a fun summer project. You should try it sometime if you're bored. Make your kids do this in the summer, okay? That's a good kids project when they say, Mom, I'm bored, and there's no school. You just make them go count variants. Okay, I counted 3,058 variants. Okay, now the problem with that, and folks like Bart Ehrman will love to point this out, in John 18, there's only probably about 800 words in Greek in John 18. Yeah, in the original text. So someone like Bart Ehrman would love to say, we have more variants than words. Now, here's the problem. You know how statistics work, don't you? You know that statistics can be used to manipulate the way you think about something, can't they? And that's exactly what's happening here, because that's not really a fair comparison, is it? Because scribes only made mistakes in the process of copying them. So if we actually count up the total number of words they copied in those 1,600 copies and compare that to the number of variants, we end up with the fact that they copied about 1.3 million words, yeah? And that amounts to about one variant for every 400 plus words they copied. Only about one for half the chapter. Doesn't that sound much better? That's not a big deal at all. And in fact, when you look at the type of errors they make, a full 40% of them are what we call nonsense readings. This is one of my favorite academic terms because it's one of the few places where it means what it says. You know what a nonsense reading is? A reading that makes no sense. Like I told you about the one in my emails, right? When I spelled the word the, okay? Really easy for us to dismiss all those. But think about it this way, if you want to think about it this way. How many of these variants really matter? Well, I always like to say, matter for whom? Matter for me as a scholar who's trying to discern those lines of transmission I told you about? For me, they all matter because they can all tell me about family relations between manuscripts, and that's super helpful for me to study the manuscripts. Are you with me? But how many of them matter for my mom doing her devotions in the morning? That's a very different question, isn't it? One way we can get at this for ourselves is say, how many of these make it into our Bible's footnotes? How many do the translators of our English Bibles think we need to let the reader know about this variant because it's either so hard for us to figure out or we can't agree as a translation committee and it affects the meaning of the text? Well, here's some translations I looked at for this chapter. The ESV, the NIV, the NRSV, I even checked the Net Bible, which is famous for having tons and tons of footnotes. 0. None of these translations note a single variant in their footnotes for John 18. Are you with me? So are there a lot of variants? There are. How many of them matter? Very, very few. All right, I'm going to skip this slide. Another way to get at this is to ask ourselves, how often do the editors that put together our Greek New Testaments that's behind your English translation, how often do they throw their hands up and say, we don't know? Or throw their hands up and say, we think none of the manuscripts are right. That the original text that Matthew wrote or that Mark wrote or that Paul wrote has actually been lost to us. Well, let's look. In 1881, two British scholars by the name of Westcott and Hort put together what has been a monumental, very famous edition of the Greek New Testament. And in doing that, with the evidence they had at the time, okay, remember we're always discovering new evidence, aren't we? The evidence they had at the time in 1881, they had 63 places where they suspected that the original text had been lost. Yeah? Now I don't know if that may seem like a lot to you. For me as a scholar who studies the ancient world, that's still not very much for a book as big as the New Testament. But maybe 63 bothers you. Okay, well fast forward to 1927. And a new edition called the Nestle edition that was very popular by then, the editor there had 18 places. Okay? The newest edition of the Nestle, which is called the Nestle Aland, the 28th edition that came out in 2012, this is the version I have my students buy at the seminary where I teach. When I teach them Greek, I have them buy this edition, has two places where the editors think, maybe all the manuscripts are wrong and we need to guess. Are you with me on this? The most recent Greek New Testament in 2017 has 0. Now, partly that's based on principle, okay? But do you see what's happening? You see how the number is going down? So when someone says to you, the further away we get from the time of the New Testament, the less we know about what the original text said because we're further along in that telephone game, you need to say to them, that's the opposite of the truth. In fact, because we've discovered more and more manuscripts as time has gone on, friends, you have a better Bible text than the Reformers did. And I don't know about you, but I think the Reformers did some pretty good theology from the text of the Bible that they had. Are you with me on that? Your text of the Bible is better than probably at any time in history, I would say, at least on the New Testament side. Now, another question we need to ask then is, well, what about Christian doctrine? Are doctrines affected by any of these difficult variants that do remain, that scholars like me do continue to study and try to resolve with the manuscript evidence we have? Well, let me show you an example that I think may be somewhat pertinent to what we're going to hear about this week. This is in Acts 13:33 in one of Paul's sermons. It's Paul and Barnabas in the synagogue at Pisidian Antioch. And Paul says, we bring you the good news that what God has promised to the Father, this he has fulfilled to blank by raising Jesus from the dead. And in our manuscripts, we find some differences. Our majority of manuscripts say these promises have been fulfilled to us, their children. Yeah? But the earliest manuscripts say to our children. And then one of those two places where the editors have guessed, this is one of them, they've guessed that it's us, the children. Now you can see there's no difference in meaning between A and C, is there? It's a very slight difference in the Greek text. This is, in my opinion, a difficult decision as a textual scholar. Are you with me? But what if I were to stand up here and say to you, because I'm not entirely sure whether it's reading A, B, or C, therefore, you can't trust the resurrection. Wouldn't you say that's silly? I mean, of course it is. That's ridiculous. The issue of the resurrection is not in play at all here. It's only the precise way in which Paul has said the resurrection has been filled. Now, I'm a Christian with a very high view of the Scriptures. Do you know what? I want to know what Paul said. Because I believe every word that comes from the mouth of God is for my good and for my benefit. Are you with me? But I need to keep this in perspective and not draw silly conclusions like, well, if I don't know exactly what he said here, therefore I can't be sure about the resurrection. Are you with me? So it's really important to keep these variants in perspective, all right? So are variants found in important verses? I would say yes, some of them are. I showed you one with the prayer of Jesus from the cross to open with. But do variants undermine Christian doctrine? I think the answer is unequivocally no, they do not. I don't know any church, for example, that in its doctrinal statement has a point on what exactly Paul said here in Acts 13:33. Do you? Now, I know churches like to split over silly things, but I've never met one that split over that. I would say the resurrection is a bit more important, wouldn't you? I would say it's the foundation of our faith, right? The reason for this is because, as John Frame says, Scripture is highly redundant in a good way, such that the doctrines of the Christian faith are never derived from a single text, and I would say from a single variant. Aren't you thankful for that? And I would say when we Christians do theology at our best, when we're doing it the best way we can, we do what Paul says also in Acts. We take into account the whole counsel of God, do we not? We don't just say, well, here's one little word and one little verse, do we? At the same time, we continue to try to search for that original text as best we can because, by the way, this is a German scholar, Johann Albrecht Bengel from the 18th century. In Germany, they make stamps for their New Testament textual critics. Now, I don't know if any of you here work for the post office, but I'm just going to say, if anybody wants to make a stamp for me, I will not say no. All right, okay. But anyways, here's what Bengel said. He said, in the same way that a grain of gold, no matter how small, is still gold, so the smallest portion of the word which comes from the mouth of God is divine. Amen? That's why people like me do what we do. Because there are still places where I want to know, and we're not sure because of the manuscript evidence is conflicting. And we continue to study and develop new methods and discover new manuscripts and study them in more depth. And that helps give us greater confidence in some of these places where we still are not 100% sure what the New Testament writer said. All right? I want to leave you with this. If you want to know more about this, I have a book at our table. You can stop by our seminary booth. I co-direct what's called the Text and Canon Institute. The book is about myths and mistakes that Christian apologists tends to make, and it's designed to help you as Christians have the best information you can, not the information that sometimes does get confused or has been misused. So pick that up if you want. And then our website at textandcanon.org is a great place to go. We have articles there on how we got the Bible, spanning everything from the question of canon, which I didn't talk about today, of course, to the Old Testament, to translation. We'd love for you to go there. They're accessible articles. You can go to our articles page and filter them even by level all the way from beginner to advanced. And so thank you so much for your time.